The thing is though, Tim Severin didn't really pursue this in any meaningful way beyond just a few paragraphs in his book about the Odyssey, but I think there's a really strong case to be made for this idea, for this conclusion, that there's a connection between the Cyclopes and the Minoans. I think I've uncovered more evidence that offers support for this theory. So first of all, although Tim Severin does point out that many of the Minoan cities were abandoned after the Bronze Age, he doesn't really point out any archaeological evidence of what happened to the Minoans afterwards. Now, I've already done a video about this, what happens to the Minoans after the Bronze Age. Now, as I pointed out in that video, the particular settlement in question, which was a late Minoan settlement, was high up on a mountain. However, what I don't think I explained as far as I remember in that video is that this actually was a phenomenon which was seen all across much of Crete. There were lots of Minoan refugee settlements, as they're known, where evidently the Greeks were pushing them out of their cities, out of the Minoan cities, and so the Minoans were seeking refuge high up on mountains, far away from the Greek cities. Now this ties in well with what Tim Severin speculated about the Minoans reverting to a simpler lifestyle after abandoning their cities. Not that they literally became savages, of course they didn't, but from the point of view of the Greeks, those Minoans certainly would have become much simpler mountain dwellers in comparison to, from their point of view, much more sophisticated Greeks living in the actual cities. So that ties in very well with Tim Severin's suggestion that the form of life that the Minoans developed after the Bronze Age could have been presented by the ancient Greeks in a mythological sense as savage mountain dwellers, exactly like the Cyclopes are presented in the Odyssey. But as well as this archaeological contribution to the debate, there's also some textual evidence which supports this conclusion. One particularly notable thing that the Cyclops does in the Odyssey is he hurls an enormous boulder at Odysseus as they are trying to escape from the island. Now that's interesting because think about it, he's a giant figure and he hurls an enormous boulder at a ship that's sailing away from the island. Now that's very similar to another Greek tradition about a giant figure who hurled boulders at passing ships. The figure in question was Talos. Now he was said to have been the guardian of Crete. He was said to have been this enormous bronze figure who threw boulders at ships that passed by. So for one thing, that supports the identification of Polyphemus' island as being Crete, because it suggests, given the similarities between these two figures, this Cyclops, and by the way, the Cyclopes were connected with the metalworking in Greek tradition, and this giant bronze figure who did the same thing as Polyphemus. So it helps to identify Polyphemus' island as being Crete, the island of Talos. What I'm suggesting is that Talos and Polyphemus originally were the same figure, but they've come down to us from two separate traditions, therefore becoming two separate figures, but ultimately they have the same origin. That's what I'm suggesting based on their clear similarities. Now if that's so, then that would mean that Crete, the island of Talos, would be identifiable as the island of Polyphemus, and that dovetails perfectly with the evidence regarding the route of the Odyssey as pointed out by Tim Severin. But regarding the connection to the Minoans specifically, there's a tradition which, as far as I'm aware, is the earliest tradition about the lineage of Talos, which identifies Talos as the son of a king called Cres. Now Cres appears in another Greek record as the king of the Eteocretans. Now if you remember, the Eteocretans appear to have been the Minoans. The Eteocretans were the true Cretans, presented in Greek tradition as the native inhabitants of the island, so evidently the Minoans. And Cres, the first king of the Minoans, according to Greek tradition, was supposed to have been the father of Talos, so that identifies Talos as an Eteocretan figure. So if the Eteocretans really were the Minoans, and I think the case for that is very firm,